Hitler is dead. Germany has surrendered. The Axis is finished. So the war is over, right? Wrong. And this time there is no chance for the Cold War because it's already gone hot. Here's who actually would have won if the USSR and the USA went right to war after World War II. The war wouldn't be decided by who moved first, but by who could keep fighting once the shock wore off. It all started with a distant rumbling that woke First Lieutenant Dan Coyle. It was coming from the Russian side of the river. Not gunfire, engines, heavy ones. He lifted himself halfway out of his Sherman as dawn barely lifted the fog along the river. Across the water, shapes moved, low, angular silhouettes emerging from the gloom. The war was supposed to be over, but whatever was moving out there didn't get the memo. Someone was moving tanks and infantry. Coyle knew tanks. He hunted Panzers for 2 years. He knew what a Tiger sounded like when it was winding up to kill you. And this wasn't German. As he stared at the approaching machinery, the realization suddenly hit him. T-34s, Soviet tanks, with trucks and half-tracks behind them. He shouted an alert that roused his crew from its slumber inside the belly of the metal Titan. Other crews picking up the alarm in his voice and rushing to man their own tanks. Coyle was in command of a platoon, 5 Shermans, 3 standard models, and another upgraded jumbo variant like his own. The 2 jumbos led the pack with their additional 1.5 inches of front and side armor. The tanks were placed in overwatch of the single river crossing in their sector. It was a strategic crossing. If anyone wanted to move big tanks and trucks from East Germany to West Germany, his bridge and 5 others were the only way to do it. Coyle knew that, and that added to his sense of urgency. He counted 6 tanks in total, 2 platoons, escorting trucks and half-tracks which he guessed would be loaded with infantry. The Soviets had to go down a narrow street and then turn right, traveling along the river to get to the bridge. He had their flanks now, their thin side armor completely vulnerable to his 75mm gun. If he ordered it, his tanks could eliminate the Soviets in seconds. Coyle had the shot. Every instinct told him to fire, but he couldn't be the man who started World War III, so he waited. He quickly placed a call to headquarters. There was no clear answer, just one question. Have you been fired on? Negative, not yet. The Soviet tank approached the bridge, turning left. It was the last clean shot he would get. Thin side armor, perfect angle, 1 order away, and then the tank kept rolling. The chance was gone. They were approaching a U.S. military police checkpoint. Through his sight, Coyle watched the MPs step out onto the bridge, confused, waving the tank down. The T-34 slowed. Coyle let himself breathe. Then, the lead tank turned its gun, not at the bridge, but at the Americans, and it opened fire. The war had just begun. The 7.62mm machine gun strafed the American military police, cutting them down where they stood. Then the tank revved its powerful engine and charged forward. The Soviets knew the Americans had tanks in Overwatch, but they moved them frequently and they camouflaged them. The Soviet commander appreciated the Americans' discipline. He looked forward to learning from his Allied counterparts. Now the only lessons they would teach him were on the battlefield. Coyle's gunner did not wait for the order to open first. He sent a high-explosive 75mm round center mass downrange. The heavy round smashed into the tank with enough force to cause it to swerve, but the sloped armor deflected most of the kinetic and explosive energy. No kill, reload! Coyle knew he didn't have to issue the command, but it helped to keep his nerves calm in the battle. The 4 other Shermans opened up in rapid succession. The lead T-34 was charging down the bridge at full speed. It had to get clear before it was hammered into submission, and it blocked the bridge for its comrades. But the Sherman fire was accurate and rapid, its veteran crews capable of up to 20 rounds a minute for a few minutes before exhausting themselves, and the Sherman's great optics made their shots accurate. The T-34's armor slope gave it an effective protection of around 90mm of steel plating, comparable to the Sherman. Where it was better was in repeated hits, but nothing could stop the onslaught of 75mm fire, and the lead tank burst into flames. At the last moment, either through blind luck or a brave driver, the tank swerved left, smashing into the concrete guardrail and tumbling into the water, leaving the bridge open for the rest of the formation behind it. The lead tank was dead, its crew either killed in the fight or drowning inside of their metal tomb. But they had managed one crucial task before perishing, sighting in the Shermans on top of their hill. With a quick radio call, artillery crews a dozen miles back had begun their punishing fire. High-explosive shells slammed into the hillside with terrifying accuracy. The Soviets hadn't just found them, they had already planned for this. And for now, surprise was enough. In between barking out targeting orders, Coyle made his own radio call too. American artillery responded 2 minutes later. Orders were issued, fire missions approved. It wouldn't matter, it was already too late. By itself, the fight would have been written off as confusion, a misunderstanding, a rogue commander losing control, but this wasn't it. While Coil fought for one bridge, other crossings were already under fire. Airfields were being shelled. Radios across occupied Germany were lighting up with the same report. This wasn't happening in one place. It was happening everywhere. And the men making these decisions weren't on the riverbank. They were underground. The small bunker was cramped, low-ceilinged, and silent, except for the hum of ventilation. 7 men sat around the table, maps spread beneath harsh light. At the head of the table sat Joseph Stalin, his eyes fixed on Europe. This war existed because he believed the American bomb would end the next one. To his right stood Georgy Zhukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, his hands braced on the table, already leaning forward. He had won battles by moving faster than anyone thought possible, and he intended to do it again. Beside him sat Alexander Vasilevsky, quiet, precise, a notebook open but untouched. Across the table sat the head of the NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, watching everyone instead of the map. For him, wars were won by control and lost when people were allowed to think freely. At the far end waited a GRU officer, anonymous by design. He was here to deliver facts, not opinions. The mood was tense, only interrupted by the creak of Stalin's chair as he leaned forward. Report. The GRU man spoke first. Nearly 100% success. American resistance was minimal for the first 3 hours. Nearly 100%, Beria cut in. The GRU man stared him down before continuing. One bridge was destroyed by artillery. The Americans were alert. Our fighters found the artillery position and punished them severely in retaliation. Beria sneered. So the attack was successful despite the failure of the army. Zhukov shot daggers at Beria. Every hour we hesitate gives them time to recover. The NKVD man ignored him. As we speak, thousands of soldiers are crossing into Allied-held Germany. But what concerns me is the supply situation. It was Russia's dirty secret. The Red Army ran on American supply: trucks, aircraft, food, fuel, radios, ammunition. The aid had dried up as the war came to an end. The Americans always feared that the Soviets would be the next big problem. The foresight had proven true, though perhaps for reasons the Americans themselves were to blame for. We have 6.5 million men, Zhukov stated, and they require food, fuel, vehicles, and rail, Vasilevsky replied, none of which move faster than tanks. The men started arguing amongst themselves, voices fraught with tension, resentment, and ambition. Stalin watched for a moment and then cleared his throat. Comrades, what concerns me is the American bombs. A hush fell over the men as they considered their leader's words. The American atomic bomb, the most feared weapon of the war, and the very reason for its sudden continuation. America's atomic bombings of Japan had brought to a close the Pacific chapter, but it had ensured the European one would remain open. When the first images of the attack on Hiroshima had reached Moscow, Stalin and his senior-most advisors, many of which were the same men in this room, had locked themselves in a meeting that had run for almost 18 hours. Food had been brought in. The senior generals and politicians wheeling it in themselves as they ordered the catering pages away. Such had been the extreme secrecy of it. In the end, it had been decided the American atomic bomb posed too great a risk. Stalin had not been surprised by its development. A member of the senior physics staff on the Manhattan Project, Klaus Fuchs, was their primary mole. But lesser-placed spies had gleaned some details of the U.S. effort. What no Soviet spy had been able to deliver is an accurate report on the total stockpile of atomic bombs the U.S. possessed, or how fast they could build them. This left the interpretation up to fear alone for the Soviet high command. With no atomic bomb of their own, they were effectively at the mercy of the U.S. The entire world was. The only way to ensure survival was to strike before the U.S. could bring significant numbers of them to bear, and to strike fast and hard. If Stalin's spies had been better placed, war may have been averted altogether, though. The U.S. had no assembled bombs by the time Berlin had been pacified. A plutonium bottleneck existed that made it impossible to build more than one bomb a month. Despite U.S. efforts to hurriedly rectify the situation, it would still be a year before it was making more than a handful every 30 days. As Stalin's troops smashed into the surprised and unprepared Allied forces in Germany, the expected atomic retaliation would not be coming for at least another week or two. It was Zhukov's time to speak now. As we have discussed, the faster we take West Germany, the safer we are from American bombs. Their bombers lack the range to reach Moscow in anything but a one-way run. The more territory we take, the safer we are from atomic attack. Zhukov spoke confidently, and he was right. With a range of about 4,000 miles, America's B-29s couldn't reach deep into the USSR. American fighters like the Mustang, Lightning, and Thunderbolt were fearsome, but they lacked the range to escort atomic bombers to targets inside of Europe. The Soviets were outmatched by the Americans in numbers. The US fielded about 28,000 fighters across the Pacific and Europe, with the Russians fielding about 18,000. but Soviet fighters could be concentrated on the European front, while the US would have to keep some forces in the Pacific for peacekeeping. Once the air war got into full swing, though, it would be an uphill battle for the Red Air Force. Soviet fighters were mostly designed for low-altitude attack in support of frontline troops. Meanwhile, American fighters were more sophisticated, with an emphasis on deep, penetrating attacks. But all that really mattered was keeping American bombers out of Moscow. Zhukov moved to a large wall map signaling to the various areas as he spoke. Our three-axis attack continues as planned. The Allies are thinly spread out, their soldiers tired and expecting to go home. Our primary axis spears through Berlin to Magdeburg and then Hanover. The second axis advances through Dresden to Leipzig and then Frankfurt. Lastly, we'll strike through Bohemia to Bavaria, and this will secure Germany in our hands. From there to France to widen the buffer. They believed the Americans were already in the process of drawing down the British too. Their own forces outnumbered them more than 2-1. 6.5 million Russian troops were amassing on 4 fronts. The Americans were believed to be below 3 million on the continent. The British had 1 million, and the French already had begun disbanding their 500,000 troops. Russia was committing 4 tank armies of 11,500 tanks total to the assault. The Allies had about 6,000 tanks left, but half were en route to western ports for transport home. In the air, there were 14,500 aircraft, mostly Yak-9 and La-7 fighters, and IL-2 ground attack in support of their infantry and armor. Airfields had already been targeted, and there was a suppression campaign to keep American and British fighters away from the front. Beria cleared his throat, interrupting Zhukov. I have to stress that the army must move quickly. Allied air power will vastly outnumber us. Without capturing airfields in France, we will lose air superiority within weeks. Even after, the American Air Force will be our greatest problem, as it was Hitler's. The room was quiet for a moment, all turning to Stalin. Everyone knew the implication. If they wanted to truly defeat the US, they had to crush Britain. Otherwise, they faced the same problem of defending the entire European coast from invasion as Hitler did. American air power had to be neutralized or kept out of the fight. No amount of propaganda would make any of the men gathered here today believe that an air victory against the US was even remotely possible. Stalin nodded at Zhukov. On the map, Zhukov pointed out projected goals of the 3 current advances. We expect to encircle 2 Allied corps and advance at least 45 miles within the first week. But American bombers will begin to fly soon, and we are ill-prepared to intercept them if they attack frontline logistics. The room went silent again. Zhukov spoke the truth. The American and British were masters of high-altitude bombing, and the Germans never really took to it with proficiency and expertise that the Allies had. The Soviets hadn't had nearly as many concerns with strategic bombing as the Germans and the Japanese had, and both Axis powers had just lost the war, largely in part to the crushing punishment of American and British bomber power. The next 72 hours would prove decisive. Where would the first atomic bombs fall? Speed would decide the opening moves. Survival would depend on something else entirely. Beria looked at the bunker around him, probably not this close to Moscow, but would it be any better if they incinerated hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in Germany instead? The first year of the war had been marked with huge territorial gains for the Soviet army, taking full advantage even before the German army had formally surrendered. The Allies were tired of war, and initially the America First Committee had seen a resurgence of political support in favor of isolationism. However, the full weight of the Soviet betrayal had been expertly manipulated by the Truman administration, who ultimately knew that just like the Nazis, a Russian problem in Europe would soon become a global one. America could never be secure with the Russians in control of Europe. Troops had been redrafted, a burning fury against the Soviets whom they had supplied with so much war-winning hardware now turned on Allied troops, spurring a vigor to fight again. This time, though, Truman promised a shorter war backed by the power of America's atomic bombs. The biggest problem had been with plutonium bottlenecks, but with the full weight of U.S. industry turning in pursuit of nuclear warfare, that had quickly been resolved. Unlike the Soviets, American industrial might had never felt the fires of war. The U.S. was and remained an industrial superpower, completely out of reach of enemy attack. The same industry that had won a 2-front global war and equipped its allies now brought its full might to bear on the Soviet threat. For 6 months, the world had lived without another atomic blast. That would soon change. The first bomb took weeks to arrive, and it hit the Soviet forces east of the Rhine. The second bomb hit a month later. The Soviets had started the war exactly the way they needed to. But now America had stopped reacting and started producing. Soon the atomic attacks had increased, 2 each month, until abruptly ceasing on the first anniversary of the conflict. Stalin had proposed a peace deal. Ironically, his fear that a U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons would mean the Soviet Union's extinction had been the exact instrument of the Soviet Union's pending extinction. Unrestricted nuclear warfare began on the 18th month anniversary of the war, with the U.S. having enough material for 13 bombs. B-29 Silverplates couldn't make the trip to Moscow from Allied airfields in the UK. Instead, they waged a sweep-the-rug campaign, gradually devastating Soviet forces and infrastructure all the way back to their own border. Headquarters, rail junctions, logistics depots, and airfields in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltics were struck first in a coordinated day-one attack that saw 32 A-bombs dropped on Soviet forces. It was hoped the overwhelming atomic attack would break the spirit of the Soviet commanders, but Stalin dug in his heels and executed anyone who protested. 5 more nuclear attacks were then carried out on Kiev, Baranovichi, Klaipeda, Crimea, and the newly renamed Kaliningrad. The next day, 5 more A-bombs were dropped on Soviet formations inside of Ukraine. With every atomic attack, Soviet forces were forced further back out of the territory that they had captured in France. Logistics were annihilated, and new airfields being built in Iran would soon allow the U.S. to drop atomic bombs on Soviet oil infrastructure in the Caucasus. Every month, U.S. bomb production capability increased by 2 to 3 now that the plutonium bottleneck had been solved. And with Allied forces on the offensive in France and Belgium, the reach of American B-29s would increase until the Soviet Union's inner circles were exposed to nuclear fires. Stalin's only hope lay in that public outrage over the staggering civilian toll of American atomic bombings would spur the U.S. to call for an end to the war. His own atomic weapon program had long ago floundered. Despite stolen secrets from the U.S., high-level Soviet researchers were secretly fleeing along with their families, fearing the atomic wasteland the USSR would soon become. The engines of 2 B-29s roared to life on a Finnish military airfield, the American crews rushing through their pre-flight checklists. In the belly of each bomber was the latest generation atomic bomb, 4 times the size of the one dropped on Nagasaki. The B-29s lifted up into the sky, met with their waiting Mustang fighter escorts. Somewhere below, Finnish aviators wished the Americans luck. They had borne the weight of Soviet aggression almost without aid at the start of the Second World War. Now they aimed to be the dagger, stabbing straight at Moscow's heart, that ended it and got their stolen territory back. From the inner Finnish airfields, the trip to Moscow was only a few hundred miles. The B-29s would drop their bombs in the north and south of the city, causing a massive firestorm driven by nuclear winds that would sweep across the heart of the city. Hundreds of thousands were estimated to die today. The Red Army could take ground. It couldn't outlast an enemy that turned factories, bombers, and time itself into weapons. In the end, the Soviets may have won the opening moves, but once America stopped reacting and started producing, the battlefield shifted to air power, logistics, and the bomb. The USSR could start the war, but it couldn't sustain it, and it's the United States that ends it, not with a single decisive battle, but by systematically removing the Soviet Union's ability to keep fighting at all. What happens when the bombs drop? Watch What If There Was a Nuclear War Between the US and Russia to see how that scenario would unfold, or click on this video instead.